Okay, bonjour, hello, bonsoir. Greetings, welcome back to the Philosophy Club here in sleepy Bétet in the middle of France, the old heartland of Gaul, Druid heartland. It's a very beautiful part of the world. We had a beautiful Sunday today, lovely sunshine. I went for a walk in the sun, popped into the local church here, which is from the 12th century, said my prayers. I think these churches should be kept alive. I'd love to run a kind of Bible study class there or something, because they're hardly used at the moment. One vicar comes every month to do a service. I think the local villagers should keep these things going as a study centre. Now, I've said this before, but when I've been to Israel or any synagogue anywhere in the world, there's always a library of books in the synagogue, of commentaries on the prophets and even some Kabbalistic books, and the whole of the Torah is there and all the different prophets and stuff. Now, when you go into the little Christian churches, there's nothing. There isn't even a Bible in this local one. At least in the Anglican ones, they have some Bibles, and they usually have a little, help yourself to some books type thing. So I'm tempted to get it going here in this little village. We need to, Christianity is a literate religion, and how can we claim that with no books in sight? There was a time when, in the 1200s, when the Dominicans led a thing in France to burn the Jewish Talmud. And with the king, they got all the Jewish Talmuds printed, handwritten in France, to be sent to central locations. And then they ceremoniously burned them like an auto da fe, with the Dominican priests acting as the executioners. The reason is that there are parts in the Talmud that were slightly critical of Jesus. I haven't ever read those bits myself personally, but I'm told there are. And, I regard that as not the way to conduct interfaith dialogues. We shouldn't burn each other's books. I mean, some fanatics have burned Qurans recently, and then that of course causes all kinds of trouble. I don't know that anyone's ever burned the New Testament, but there may be some instances. So against this, I'd like to draw people's attention to a wonderful event going on in Spain at the moment, called the International Day of Tolerance. And it happened, it was on Friday, the International Day of Tolerance, in Malaga, and it was organised by the Higher Committee for Human Fraternity of Abu Dhabi in the Gulf. It had Nobel laureates for peace attending, Baroness Carmen Thyssen, and Spanish royalty and all kinds of people from the UN and UNESCO, and my friend Alexander Beauharnais attended. And he's still down there in Malaga. This is a thing for Jewish, Christian and Muslims to come together and talk, as well as all the other religions, about what do we have in common, what is tolerance. That's the way to go, not burning each other's books. We should study them. And if we don't like what we find in some of them, then we should say why not, and critique it. And that's a more mature intellectual discourse, I think. Thank God we've come a long way from the days of burning books, but not that long ago, in the 1940s here in France, the Nazis were rounding up Jewish books as well, and confiscating them and taking them to Berlin and piling them in warehouses. Also, they were confiscating Freemasonic texts as well, and anything they deemed unacceptable. Well, as a scholar, I believe in freedom of thought, freedom of writing, freedom of ideas, like Voltaire, and that's the whole point of the Enlightenment. How can we have tolerance based on silencing, suppression? Nowadays it's a bit more dangerous because with the social media, we can silence people's ideas with sort of, witch hunts conducted on the internet and all this kind of thing. So we're facing some new problems that we hadn't thought of. Everyone thought the internet's a wonderful tool for liberation, but it can become a tool for despotism. And apparently, according to Elon Musk, you can just buy it and then you become the influencer. So it can hijack democracy. And we can all be suddenly deciding that Putin is absolutely a genius and Trump is his best friend. And yes, Ukraine is a pesky little country that should surrender and, you know, everyone should go home and stop fighting and let Russia rule. I don't think so. That's not where I'm coming from, as you probably know. As a philosopher, I still believe in values of tolerance and fair play and justice and peace and all the rest of it. So that's what I've been up to. Now, I want to share something that's sheds light on this, the Russia-Ukraine problem, because it's not gone away. It's been there, you know, for the last 3 years, 2 years. It's a nightmare, and it's really cold at the moment. It's getting colder in Europe, and I feel sorry for actually everyone fighting on all sides. The Russian conscripts are forced to fight. They're offered in money incentives. They die in their thousands, and their families then have to mourn and grieve, and they're not told what happened. They don't know why they're fighting. They've been fed false information, you know, that the Ukrainians are fascists and have to be defeated, which is the complete inversion of truth. So this whole war started with lies. It's been fed by lies, and as a philosopher of peace, I and my colleagues in Europe and elsewhere, globally, want to say enough is enough is enough, and the only way we can do that is through truth. Now, truth takes a long time. I'm interested in what French historians call the longue durée. Truth isn't just like what happened yesterday or today, or, you know, what post did you see on Facebook an hour ago. That's what we've been told is truth. But actually, real truth is much takes longer to brew. It's like the best quality mead. We Druids love mead made of honey. And you need to brew that stuff for like years to get the really best flavours, just like with good wines, with honey and herbs and all kinds of things. So brewing truth takes a long time, and I want to just take you back into Russian history a bit, because it's one of my specialisms. I did my degree in Russian and European and world history at the University of London. I found it incredibly interesting. I was taught by Professor Geoffrey Hosking, one of Britain's leading Russian historians, at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in the University of London, and threw myself into it. I did far more work than was needed, because I wanted to study the whole history of medieval Russia. Who founded the kingdom? Where did the Rus come from? How were the Rus different to the other Slavic peoples, and so on and so on. Went back in time. And then I, of course, went to Moscow and met other philosophers and historians and intellectuals working for peace. That was in 1990. And at that time, we thought we'd ended the Cold War, we signed the Treaty of Paris, and we thought that was it. We'd won. The peace people had won. Gorbachev was the president of the then Soviet Union. And we thought everything would be sorted and we could have a civilized Europe in peace. Now, you know, it didn't work out like that, tragically. And Putin represents a certain class of Russian that never accepted that narrative of history. Putin represented a die-hard intelligence agent, a Cold War warrior from the KGB, who sees life in terms of winning and losing. He sees it in terms of peace and victory, or death and sacrifice. And they were trained to never surrender, these KGB operatives. And, you know, read any biography of Putin, and that's where he's coming from. And so he reminds me of these Japanese warriors that go on fighting for 30 years on an obscure Pacific island. They don't know that actually peace was signed. They just keep fighting on. He's like that. Only he's taken over the Russian state, and he's used his KGB skills of propaganda, because they're masters of propaganda. They can, and they have been ever since 1917, when Lenin founded the Soviet state. And that was perfected to a dark art under Stalin. And they can convince anything of anyone. That's how they operated and kept power for so long. And Putin, you know, uses people to do that. So he's managed to convince enough people in his entourage that, yes, Ukraine's an evil fascist state and therefore should be invaded. he's also managed to convince people that, you know, America's an evil fascist state for supporting them. NATO's an evil fascist organisation. France is an evil fascist organisation. Britain is, you know, etc., etc. It's like, this is the old KGB playbook, which we're seeing in real time, which I thought had gone. When I spoke to my Russian philosophy friends in Moscow in 90 and 93, they said to me, God, we've emerged out of the dark ages of Stalinism, thank God. We really want to meet, you know, people like you, intellectuals from the West, who have a different perspective, who know about Marxism and can talk about Russian philosophy, but from a critical distance. We want to learn about, you know, your theories of existence, and if you're not dialectical materialists, what are you, you know? And we had some fascinating discussions, which have continued till Putin stopped academics talking to people in the West. My Russian philosophy contacts can no longer contact me because all their emails are monitored and they're afraid they'll be silenced and, you know, put in prison, which is a very, very sad state of affairs. It means we've gone into retrograde. Okay, now I want to share something about all this, because I've been listening to a very important book, which I, you know, recommend highly to people this week, and it's been a real journey studying this work. And it's to do with the history of Russia, and it's a part of the history of Russia that I was never taught at university. We did Russian history with Britain's leading experts. I feel like, what? Why didn't they teach me this, right? I mean, I've had to wait till now to find out about it. It's shocking. Okay, so the book is called, let me get the exact title for friends here, Into Siberia, George Kennan's epic journey through the heart of Russia. Published in 1923, authored by a brilliant writer called Gregory Wallance. And I don't know who Gregory is, but hats off to you, sir. You've done an absolute masterpiece. Now, I was researching this and I thought, what, George Kennan going to Siberia? Because, of course, we all know George Kennan as the architect of containment of the Soviet Union. He was the most important foreign policy thinker in America, but also in the West generally, in the aftermath of World War II and what to do about Russia. And he came up with this idea, ultimately, of containment. You couldn't defeat Russia, it was too big, too powerful. But you could contain it. And this was the idea behind the creation of NATO, that you had to put up what Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain to prevent the ideas that Stalin embraced and stood for seeping out and taking over control in the rest of the world, in Europe and in America. So I thought, and then I looked at the book and I thought, well, this journey took place in the 1880s. Well, hang on, George Kennan wasn't alive then. And it turns out it's his, it's his cousin, his much older relative. The guy that does the journey through Siberia, which I'm going to tell you about, was the George Kennan of containment's elder relative. But they just have the same name. And in fact, the young one was named after this chap. Okay, so I'd never heard of this older Kennan. But what did he do? Extraordinary story. He was an American citizen living born around in the 1870s. He worked as a telegraphic technician before the American Civil War, and during the American Civil War he fought with the Union Army, but he was from Ohio, which was a Union state, but they used the telegraph to send messages between the president, Abraham Lincoln, in the White House, and the troops at the front. Telegraph was incredibly important in the American Civil War. And this guy, young Kennan, he was only in his early 20s, trained as an operative, and they were sending thousands of telegrams back and forth between the army commanders and the president and chiefs of staff. And that's how the Union won the war, is they had better communications. The Confederacy didn't have so many miles of telegraph poles, and therefore couldn't keep up with rapidly changing troop manoeuvres. And so that's interesting. He then didn't quite know what to do with his life. He had this skill, but what's the use of that? And through some friends and colleagues, it's a fascinating story, he met some Russians, I think in New York, who wanted to build a telegraph line between Moscow and the Far East, Vladivostok, right through Siberia. At that point, there was no telegraph poles. They were just in the process of building the Trans-Siberian Railway. And he was appointed, he got a job as part of a team to help lay the track of the telegraph poles thousands of miles from Moscow right through to Vladivostok in the Far East. And this is told in the book, absolutely fascinating. I mean, the horrors of what they had to cope with in Siberia in the winter, utterly frozen terrain, being attacked by snow, frostbite and so on, and then trying to erect telegraph poles. You can imagine what nightmare they went through, and holed up in shacks way up in the frozen north of Siberia, because they were trying to build this line along the coast, which, if you recall, a couple of weeks ago I shared the Great Northern Expedition of Peter the Great, which opened up that coastline. And so now they're trying to lay a telegraph pole 200 years after the expedition. And this young man was part of it. Anyway, long story short, after 3 years of doing this, and he describes all the horrors they faced and the challenges and armed bandits and you name it, the thing was cancelled because the Americans and the British had successfully laid a transatlantic cable. And so Russia decided it'd be easier to send telegraphs through America to the Pacific and then round that way. So this 3 years of work was sort of went up in smoke. I'm sure eventually the line was laid, but not by George Kennan. Okay, so then he goes back to America, he becomes a journalist, he writes stuff, he's a good writer. He falls in love and he wants to get married to someone called Emmeline, and he finds a job in New York working for a like Life magazine equivalent in the 19th century. And then he thinks of an idea, he meets some other Russians in New York. He's not anti-Russian at all. He admires Russian society and civilization. He speaks Russian. He spent 3 years there working with really tough, amazing Russian pioneer types. And this is the time of the British Empire at its height, 1880s. The Americans are exploring the West and expanding. He quite liked the Russians expanding to the East. He was in favour of we would now call it Russian imperialism. And he thought this is a jolly good thing. This is what civilization does, it expands. But he has heard that there's a problem in Russia with the prisons. He meets some people who tell him, yes, it's all good to sing the praises of Russia, but do you know about their prison system in Siberia? Have you heard about this? And he says, what? What problem? No. And he's taught by some people who knew about it that actually there's something to investigate. It's a bit scandalous what Russia's doing. They're hushing it up, but they're sending all political dissidents into far Siberia and working them to death. And he says, no, can't be doing that. No, they're civilized people, they wouldn't do that. So he conceives this idea, he's going to go and check it out as a fair witness. Because he's an American, by this time he's written a book about his experiences laying the telegraph thing, which has become quite famous in both the West and in Russia. It's been translated into Russian. So he says, no, they'll let me go. I'll just wander around Siberia and check out the prisons. And that's what he proceeds to do. I mean, it's an extraordinary tale of adventure. He bluffs his way through Petersburg into Moscow. I'm a well-known writer and journalist. I'd just like to do some tourism in Siberia, please. Oh yes, anything particular going to be looking into? well, just see how people live and what their living conditions are like, and check on the wildlife and stuff like that. Or I might visit the odd prison if that's okay. He sort of slips it in as an afterthought, and he gets under the censorship. But that's really his main thing, the reason for going. And so the description of what he finds, the first horror show is there's a particular staging post on the prisoner trail where all the exiles from European Russia are sent. And then they have to stay in this absolutely grotesque, horrendous prison fortress, which has no sanitation, they have nothing to keep warm at night, they have no bedding, they're all getting ill and they're dying. He goes to the hospital ward and it stinks because they've all got gangrene and they're just left to rot and die. It's a horrendous experience for him. It sort of opens his eyes as to what's happening. The offences these people have been charged with can be as minor as just saying they don't like the Tsar's hairstyle, minor stuff. And also, the communes of Russia have the power to send people in their own name to Siberia. So in this little town of Batet, or village, the mayor could send me for being a dangerous philosopher, you know, if France had the same system. And people were sent on the smallest of, you know, offences, so-called, verbal type things, whatever, and they were sent east. And it was an industrial thing, so it's thought that, these some interesting figures, between 1801 to 1918, 2 million Russians were sent to Siberia during that time, forcibly. In the same period, the UK sent 160,000 to Australia. We had a similar system. We sent criminals to Australia to work the land, but they were then able to earn their freedom depending on what crimes they'd committed, and were given land and could build their houses, and they were the Australian pioneers. And in France, it's thought that at the same time, at any one time, the penal colonies of France had about 5,000 to 6,000 inhabitants in Devil's Islands and places like that. But Russia was doing it, you know, on an industrial scale, 2 million people. And he then, I recommend the book, he goes from town to town in sleighs or carts on terrible roads, because they've got a budget from their journal in New York that's funding them. Century is the publisher. They've paid for this, and they send along an artist. Wherever they stop in a prison or something, he sketches the prisoners. And I think what I just find it very interesting. And what I found particularly moving was he goes to a particular place called Kara, which is along in Transbaikal, so now we're further east than the Baikal Lake, if you think of your map of Russia and Siberia, Kara Katorga. And it was there as a penal colony to work gold mines. And they worked them between 1838 to 1893, taking out about a ton of gold every year. Very primitive mining. He describes in the book, you know, they were just like hacking rocks out of the walls with pickaxes and things. But this also housed political prisoners by now. And one of the women that was housed there, who he has got a letter of introduction to from back in Moscow, he goes to see her. She's called Natalia Armfelt, lived from 1850 to 1887. And I'd not heard of her before, but her father was a professor of science in Germany, and she started studying mathematics at the University of Heidelberg. She was an intellectual. But she was so fed up with the Russian system that she joined the revolutionaries and was part of groups that were somehow plotting to overthrow this corrupt Tsarist regime. And she was sentenced, she served her time, went back, and then went to live in the Ukraine, and joined a revolutionary organisation. They were having a meeting, and you can sort of see the scene, 25 intellectuals, various forms of beards, all smoking away, discussing policy, and suddenly the gendarmes start firing. Somebody gave them away. And in the shootout, 2 officers are killed and 4 revolutionaries, and she's rounded up with all the others. And they're sentenced to decades of imprisonment in Siberia. She's only a fairly young girl, in her late 20s, 30s at this time. And so she's shipped off to this camp in far Siberia, where she has to work in the gold mines. Hard labour, the sentence was. She's just got out of that, and so she's now able to kind of, live without having to do the hard labour, but she's still in exile for decades to come. And how she got out was because her mother, who was the wife of the professor, had written to Tolstoy about her case. Tolstoy didn't like this prison system. He was embarrassed about it. He was a Christian. He was an Orthodox Christian, but he felt what the Tsar was doing was wrong, because it was punishing people for thinking. And he knew friends who'd been arrested and captured and put in these camps where they never escaped. And he took up her case, and he wrote through I think it was his mother, who knew the Tsar. They managed to get Natalia Armfeldt's mother permission to go and live in Siberia. I mean, you'd have thought they would have tried to get her out, but no, at least they got the mother to go. And this is something that happened in this prison camp system, is your relatives could come and live with you. But once they did that, they could never go back to European Russia. It was a prison sentence for life. And they often didn't know this. So if a wife volunteered to go with her husband on the trail, she might not realise that was it. She'd never able to go back to European Russia. Not only that, but the prisoners treated her as common property. So along the route, which took months, if not years, she'd be raped repeatedly, and there was nothing that the guards never interfered. She was regarded as just common property, and if the husband tried to do something, he'd be killed. So the horrendous treatment of these women was shocking. But as part of the degradation, really, that Tolstoy was complaining about, that this was affecting the Russian soul. So he managed to get Natalia's mother to go. Okay, fast forward, George Kennan, who's a clever chap, has the letter of introduction to Natalia, and he goes to the town where she's captured and held, and he chats up the governor, and he has this habit of going up to the top and talking to the governors, having wine and cigars with them, and then getting a permission to go around and look around. Oh, I'm just a little tourist chap. I'm interested in Russian culture and folklore type of thing. So he then goes to visit Natalia Armfeldt, and the description of their encounter, their meeting, is very moving. And tragically, she gives him some letters to smuggle out back to her family. He is staying with the town mayor, and he's given his word not to do any kind of communications with dissidents. You're not allowed to smuggle letters back. He's sworn that, and so he's faced with a dilemma, because he overhears people in the hall saying, "We're a bit suspicious about that guy who's always hanging around the prison. I think we better search his luggage." And his host says, "No, we can't do that. He's an American citizen. It'd be a diplomatic incident." But then that's enough to warn him. And so that night he burns the letters, because he's given his word he's not going to do it, and he didn't feel comfortable. His conscience wouldn't let him cheat on this guy. It might get him into trouble too. But anyway, the tragedy is he later regretted it, because 2 years later Natalia died of tuberculosis at the young age of 37. Now Tolstoy knew of her story because of family involvement, and his last great novel, called Resurrection, I didn't know this, is based on her. I always found Resurrection a frustrating book. I mean, I loved War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and Tolstoy was my favourite novelist in my teens. But when I read Resurrection, it was just, I didn't quite get it. It didn't seem up to the quality of the others. But now I'm going to have to reread it, because the heroine of that book, Anna, is modelled on Natalia Armfeldt. I didn't know this. So I'm going to revisit it. And what that novel is about is that in spite of the horrors we go through in life, in spite of the wars, in spite of the injustice, because it's set around the prison camp system, and the heroine in the book goes with her husband into the depths of Siberia. In spite of all that, it is possible that we can find some kind of redemption out of this hell, and that a resurrection is possible. It's quite Christian, obviously. It's the most Christian of his books. But I'd recommend it. And there's another tragedy I learned studying this, that in this place where Natalia Armfeldt died of TB, they were not very nice to the women prisoners. And there was a particular incident in 1889, on the 6th of November, when a woman prisoner called Nadezhda Sigida, who was 27 years old, was whipped mercilessly by the guards for some minor infringement of the rules. Being whipped is not, I imagine, a very pleasant experience at the best of times, but if you're in freezing temperatures and you're starving to death and you're a woman, and it must be absolutely horrendous. Anyway, she couldn't take it, and that night she took poison and killed herself in a protest against the horrors that were going on. And a few days later, 23 other political prisoners, men and women, all took poison in protest and in solidarity with her in this same place. And four of them died. 4 women and 2 men actually succeeded in killing themselves. And this news became, like, every intellectual in Russia protested. They said, look, enough is enough. This massacre, it was called the Kara Katorga massacre, became infamous. And 2 years later they abolished whipping as a punishment for, I think, all prisoners, certainly women prisoners. Flogging of women was abolished in 1893. It took that to get the law changed. I mean, that's how like insensibly frozen the conscience of the Russian system was in the 1890s. And that's what Tolstoy was up against. I mean, he knew all about that. There's a famous artist, one of Russia's most famous realist artists, Nikolai Kosatkin. He did a famous painting called, it was called The Catastrophe of Katorga, Kara Katorga, which is one of the classic Russian paintings. So, okay, I want to make a few observations here about all this, because firstly, we all know about the Soviet camps under Lenin and Stalin and how horrendous they were. I read the Gulag Archipelago of Solzhenitsyn, and we all were horrified by it, and it was part of the revulsion we all felt about that kind of Stalinist system in the, well, I came to it in the 70s, but other people were reading it in the 60s and 70s. Well, I think it was published in the 70s in French and English. And it was part of why the system began to change. But what Solzhenitsyn didn't explain was that this was a thing inherited from the Tsarist times, that the camp system of the communists was not their invention. This was already